this is my country. So when people have said to me, oh, your English is so good, I'm like, thank you. Really, I'm working on my Spanish. Or when they say, go back where you came from, and I'm like, I'm already here. That this is an interesting intersection that's emerging in North Carolina, this confusion that somehow Latino equals immigrant. An immigrant equals undocumented, and that somehow they're always one and the same thing. So you're having a conversation about an undocumented immigrant, and then all of a sudden you're having a conversation about the economic impact of Latinos in North Carolina, as if this were the same conversation to be having. And this is a phenomenon that is very prevalent in North Carolina, and frankly, very dangerous. Very dangerous. But that's where we are. So this is where it all starts. It all started with these numbers. This conversation in North Carolina really popped off when these numbers came out. So what's happening? Why North Carolina? It's this fascinating, perfect storm that developed over North Carolina that created this situation. First of all, North Carolina had an economic boom. It was this dramatic economic shift that happened in the mid-90s. It really took off in the mid-90s. What happened in the mid-90s? 1994, NAFTA gets signed and goes into effect. Immediately, industries that had been the base of local economies all throughout North Carolina disappeared. And the conversation in the mid-90s was, they sent my job to Mexico. And they did. They took the jobs, and with NAFTA, they went right across the border into Mexico. Because what did NAFTA do? NAFTA said to Mexico and to Canada, but in a different kind of way to Mexico, what you need to do is you need to sign a structural adjustment plan. And through this structural adjustment plan, you'll make yourselves more attractive to industry. And if you do that, we'll offer you economic bailouts, because Mexico was in an economic crisis. They said, we'll offer you economic bailouts if you sign these agreement plans under NAFTA to attract industry to come to your country. So Mexico did that. The Mexican government signs the structural adjustment plans, joins up with NAFTA, and in comes the industry. What did they do to make themselves more attractive to industry? A few things. And this is where the intersections of all of our issues start to come together. One, they had to make it more profitable for industry to do their business in Mexico than here. So one of the things they did, they lowered environmental regulations. They lowered environmental regulations so that they didn't have to deal with the EPA and all of the costs that cut on into their profit margin. Because in Mexico, they didn't have to worry about that. They could dump wherever they wanted. They could emit whatever fumes they wanted. So that's what they did. They went into Mexico and they lowered their environmental protections. They didn't have to have the same worker protections. So they immediately undermined any kind of labor efforts that were happening here by going into Mexico and taking advantage of workers there. So the average Mexican worker that works in these NAFTA factories makes about $4 a day. And their working conditions in those factories are deplorable. You think that they get overtime and benefits and 401ks and health insurance, and they don't get those things. They don't talk about time and a half and vacation, and they're not getting that. So industry was really attracted to going into places like Mexico and setting up their industries and being able to take advantage of those things. So that's what they did. And there was a mass exodus of industries out of the United States, and particularly out of North Carolina. North Carolina was one of the 10 hardest hit states by NAFTA in terms of worker displacement. So the factories all go into Mexico. Then agribusiness goes into the south of Mexico, and they start taking over the land. And you have all of these farmers who, for generations, have been depending on sustenance farming, on corn, mostly corn. They're dependent on this, but they grow enough to feed themselves, their family, and sell enough at the local farmer's market. And one day he's out there with his burro, and he's working in the field, and he looks up, and this big crane is lowering a sign into the farm next door that says Dole, and they've got satellite dishes reading the weather, and they couldn't compete. They just could not compete. And over time, they lost their land. So they lost their land, and what do? They do what everyone does. They migrated to find where they could work. Here in the United States, we saw the Great Migration North when the African American community migrated north in search of jobs, in search of escape from persecution. So Mexicans did the same thing. They moved to the northern parts of Mexico and started trying to work in the maquilas, or the factories. But they're finding the same conditions there. They're being abused there. They're not being taken care of. They're not being able to make a living wage. They're suffering, and there's this massive displacement. So they start, let's talk about what happens. They start organizing. So you get 100 Mexican factory workers that get together, and they start organizing against their plant to say, we demand fair wages. We demand safe working conditions. These are the things that we need. We need to be able to have bathroom breaks and lunches and things like that, right? What does the manager say to them? Oh yeah? You guys are all organized? That's great. But we just found out that the Indonesians, they'll work for $2 a day. So we're actually going to pick up our factory and we're going to go. And that's what they do. They pick up their factory, they leave Mexico, and they go to Indonesia. And then the same dynamic, Indonesia happens, and then they move to China. And then they move to Africa, and then they move to India. And it's called a race to the bottom. This race to the bottom of finding the country that will offer the cheapest deal, the cheapest labor, the cheapest environment, the cheapest cheapest taxes, cheapest infrastructure, most willing to privatize their water, their electricity, their whatever. The industries are able to just pick up and move and chase that deal. And in their wake, devastation, economic devastation. That dynamic has been happening globally now for many years, over 10 years now since NAFTA was signed, and they keep expanding these trade agreements. But so that's part of the story, right? Now let's go back to North Carolina. You've got these Mexican workers, and their factory is either mistreating them or just left. So we'll leave Mexico for a while, and let's go back to North Carolina. North Carolina, you've got this situation where people are, they've lost their factory. The furniture factory that used to be there for generations, the textile mill, you name it, that used to be there for generations, all of a sudden is gone. And people are saying, what are we supposed to do? We need jobs. We don't have jobs. Our economies are suffering. North Carolina's solution was to intellectualize its economy. North Carolina decided to intellectualize its economy, become globally competitive. So it did things like bring in the RTP. It did things like expand the community college system, strengthen the universities. At the same time, people were having less and less children. So they have less children. Let's talk about a place like Siler City, which was really where a lot of this started to become noticeable in North Carolina. You have a family that now has 2 children instead of 5 or 6 children. They send their 2 children to UNC Chapel Hill, or Duke, or NC State, and I hope that I got most of the people in the room, right? And they send them to that university, right? Their kids go, they excel, they do well. Do you think that their kids go back and settle down in Siler City? Of course not. Most of them did not go back to Siler City and bring that education back with them. They settled down in Chapel Hill or Raleigh or Durham or Charlotte or wherever else they could take most advantage of now their education. So what's going on in Siler City? Mom and dad, who are running this farm or, this small business, and they're hoping to retire soon, and their kids are not making any plans on coming back and settling and taking over the family business, they start shutting down. The farms start going unmanned. So that dynamic was happening all over North Carolina. So you've got this intellectualizing economy. Then you have the RTP, right? The RTP basically was all about attracting people to North Carolina who think for a living. People like me. I think for a living. I think about what I think. I tell you what I think. You tell me what you think. We argue about what we think, and I produce nothing. I produce nothing, right? Somebody in North Carolina needed to produce. Somebody did, right? And so the question was, who was going to do that when more and more and more of us were thinking for a living, which is good for the state. But there was this gap, right? Okay, at the same time, sorry, Pete, it's a long slide. At the same time, North Carolina, and I arrived here in 2000, right? And I remember noticing a couple of things. One was the construction of 540 and the loops. And I come from a city where it's blocks. It's all squares. You always know where you are. In North Carolina, depending on where you get on 440, it's inner, it's outer, it's north, south, east, west. I don't even know. But they were building 540, right? This huge loop. And they were saying it could take anywhere from 25 to 50 years to complete construction on the 540 loop. And at the same time, they were expanding the number of lanes along 40.